My name is Indrani. I work in the Mechanical Engineering Department in the Student Services Office, and I want to welcome you to the SoE Connect event today. I have to apologize because I seem to have pinched a nerve blow drying my hair, and I'm kind of like this, so excuse me if I'm not, So we're really excited for the turnout and excited to put this event together. The mission of SoE Connect is to provide programming that enhances the experience of staff at the School of Engineering through outreach, education, professional development. Our goal is to connect the SoE staff in a dialogue across the departments and get to know how we all are working towards the mission of the School of Engineering. This program is designed and developed by SoE staff for SoE staff, and we hope you enjoy participating as much as we enjoyed putting it together. SoE Connect Talks is a series of research presentations designed by School of Engineering faculty to give our staff a glimpse of the exciting research activities that are happening every day. We hope this will give you an opportunity to see how our very own faculty are helping to solve real-world problems and make a positive impact on our future. We will have time for a small number of questions in between each speaker, so please wait till the speakers are done before we ask questions. Our first guest is Margot Gerritsen, professor. She's an associate professor of energy research engineering, as well as by courtesy at the Mechanical Engineering and Civil and Environmental Engineering departments. She's also the director of ICME. She holds an MS degree in applied math from University of Delft and Stanford PhD in scientific computing and computational math. She specializes in renewable and fossil energy production, as well as coastal ocean dynamics and yacht design. She did a TEDx talk called Beauty I See in Algebra. Please welcome Professor Gerritsen.
I hope I'm on. Can you hear me okay? Oh, it's a check. So I had a real problem thinking about this talk, because it's supposed to enhance your experience. And I thought, okay, what I can talk about is really two things. I can talk about oil, especially unconventional oil. I'm not sure how enhancing that is. And I can talk about algebra. And of course, when you start thinking about algebra, you don't know how exciting that is going to be, right? And then they asked me to actually start the series as the first talk. So I feel a little bit awkward about this. But hey, I'm going to talk about algebra because algebra is underlying everything we do in ICME and also underlying a lot of my own work. Apart from these fluid flow problems in oil and gas and coastal ocean models and yacht design and so on, I also work on search engine design. And I do a lot of other things related to data mining and machine learning. And so I thought I'd tell you something connected to that, okay? And when you start talking about beauty and math, you immediately run into a big problem. So if you Google, for example, math beauty, you get this definition of mathematics that says math has beauty, a supreme beauty, but then it goes on to say that the beauty is cold and austere, like that of a sculpture. Now, without appeal to any part of our weaker nature. Well, that's just super appealing, right? And then I thought, well, what about algebra? So I looked for algebra beauty, and apparently there's only two people in the world that think algebra is beautiful. It's Khan and myself, right? That came up. But I will try to convince you it is very beautiful and talk to you about two research projects that I was involved in that use algebra a lot. And they're very different. One is a coastal ocean simulation model. The other one is working for the Library of Congress on their LCSH, the Library of Congress subject headings, which you probably remember from the libraries. That's on the book cover. And they seem completely disparate topics, but they all have in common algebra. Okay, so by the end of the 12 minutes, wherever I have, hopefully you will see this. If not, then you can just blame me. All right. Okay, so go back to school, blackboard. The teacher gives you this set of 3 equations. Okay, and now you all start to panic, saying, "Oh my goodness, how would I solve this?" But these systems of equations, for us, they're not dry things that you then have to solve. And you have no idea what X, Y, and Z are typically, right? For us, they're not abstract. They're living things. They symbolize physics. They symbolize engineering processes. And when we see an equation, we see a connection or a relation, right? Because no matter what sort of background you have, if I say to you, we have some X and some Y, and together they are 2. What am I expressing is that they have a connection to each other. If X changes value, Y changes value, right? There is a relation. And everything in physics, in engineering, in the sciences is about relations. Now, it's about relations in social sciences, logically, networks, social media, lots of relationships. Google searching has relationships, but also in physics. There's a relationship between the velocity of a fluid and the pressure difference or temperature difference. Right? So everything is about relations. And when we write these relations in computational mathematics, out come a bunch of equations. And these equations are determined by laws of physics. Does it make sense? Now, if you can solve this system, can you do engineering? Well, unfortunately, these systems are typically a little bit bigger. So here, this is a system of 3 equations with 3 unknowns. On an annual basis, on a daily basis, I work with systems that are maybe 1 million by 1 million, or 10 million, or maybe 500 million. So some of the systems we work with have a lot of unknowns. And if a teacher were to give you a system of equations that has 500 million equations and 500 million unknowns, you would not have liked algebra very much. So maybe with 3 by 3, it's already a little bit much, but we can deal with it because we don't have to do this by hand. We write computer programs, right? So in ICME, we spend a lot of time developing the computational engines to solve systems like that, systems that represent relations, okay? And I will show you 2. And we do this all on the computer. One of the things we do is rewrite these things, and it seems completely silly. You know, we had that system of equations here, x plus y, y minus z, x plus y plus z. You will see that in the first equation, z did not appear. You may think, oh, that's nice, then I don't have to worry about it. In the second equation, x does not appear, but you know what? We're going to put them all back, but we're multiplying them by 0. And you think, well, this is completely insane. But you know, mathematicians, like myself, we like structure. So we like to have the same pattern for every equation. Something times x plus something times y plus something times z, something else, right? It's the same pattern. And once you have established that pattern, you remember the pattern, and then all you need to remember are these numbers in front of x, y, and z. Right? That's all you need to remember. So we do that, and we put them in a table. Just a table of coefficients. But we don't call that table a table, we call it the matrix, right? Because leave it to the mathematicians to design new terminology for just simple things. Like instead of a table of coefficients, we talk about the matrix. Now, you know the matrix is super, super important, right? They even made a movie, related to matrices, right? So really, really important. And if you remember the movie, in the movie they say the matrix is everywhere, where it's true. Every little thing that's done in the school by all the faculty that you're working with, collaborating with, everything they do ultimately breaks down into systems of equations involving tables of coefficients like this, these matrices. And we love those matrices because these matrices symbolize the physics, the engineering process. They represent that. And when you get good at reading matrices from these matrix structures, you can see things from the system, right? Matrix stands for relations. Relations stands for your physical system. Yeah? Easy, huh? That's what algebra is, right? And it's everywhere, right? Underlying everything. So we love these matrices and we play with them a lot. Here is one application where we see them. So here's the bay, right? And we've been working in civil and environmental engineering on simulations of tidal flow in the bay. So what you see here is velocities, water velocities. You know, red colors mean very high velocities. You also see the velocity vectors indicated. And these are water flows in and out of the bay as a result of tidal changes. Okay, so we can simulate that on the computer. And then you may wonder, well, how do you do this and why do relationships come into play? Well, the first thing we do is to realize that we're very limited in what we can do. We cannot find velocities at every single point in the bay. We can only find it for a finite set of locations, right? It's just too much work to do it everywhere. We don't have an equation that describes this. We can solve analytically, using a little bit of hocus pocus, like integration or logarithms or exponentials. We can do that. So we actually put a mesh of points on the domain. And here we represent it with triangles. The vertex of every triangle is a point in which we want to compute the velocity. Now, and in each of these points, we say, well, how do the solution in that point relate to the solution in neighboring points? The velocity in one of the points, is that related to the velocity close by? Well, what do you think? Of course, right? If I have a really high velocity in this point, I probably have a pretty high velocity here too. The relationships, because there's physics happening in between, right? There's water connecting these things. So I can write down laws of physics that would give me relations between the velocities at all of these points. And not just the velocities, but also salinity, also pressure, all of the things that I'm interested in computing, temperature, what have you, wave height, you know, all sorts of things. So in each of these points, we compute pressure, velocity, salinities, big system of connections and relations leading to a matrix, right, that we then solve. Make sense? So that's what we do in coastal ocean dynamics. And we spend a lot of time playing with these grids, how to put them and how to get the right connections and how to translate these laws of physics to just these points. You know, we need to do some smart translation, of course, of that. So that's a really interesting field called numerical analysis, right? Now, here's another table that I'm gonna build up, another table of coefficients, another matrix that appears a lot. And now we're looking at the web. So it seems completely different, but leads to similar sort of mathematical entities, okay? And I'm taking 5 completely random websites with a random selection of words, right? So here the first one, Stanford beating California, completely random choice. And I look at the other website if these words perhaps appear, and maybe some other words as well. And I pretend that these are the only 3 words on the web page. Of course, there are many more, but for sake of argument, only 3, right? Otherwise, the table becomes too big. So I look at another website, a cooking website with beating is also a word, and eggs. And then the Muppet Show, I think this is with the word egg. The Berkeley website has California in it, and then, you know, Stanford website has the word Stanford in it. And now what I'm doing here is exactly what Google does. Now it builds a big table, and every row of this table represents a word. Now here I just picked 4 words that are common in these documents. How many words do you think Google needs to think about? Now how many words in the English language? Or maybe 500,000, right? And then you have all sorts of misspelled words that are also put in there, and bigrams, 2 words together, like New York or Britney Spears, so, you know, it's seen as one word. So all of these things happen. So you may have a couple of million of these rows, right? And then here in the columns, I have all the web pages, okay? Now what are these 1s and 0s? If a 1 appears here, it means that the word eggs does not occur in the ESPN website, okay? But here's a 1 because the word California appears on the Berkeley website, okay? So it's a very simple table that tells me exactly where words are. We call this a term document matrix, right? And in a way you could see that this will symbolize relationship between web pages. Because if these 1s and 0s agree quite a bit from one web page to another, obviously these web pages must be related, right? They're talking about similar sort of things. But what have I created? Another table of coefficients. This is another matrix, and we work with this all the time. Now this one is a really special one, this term document matrix. Unfortunately, in reality for Google, it's super big, millions and millions of words. Billions of web pages, right? So it's a huge table that they work with every single day, right? So now what I'm going to show you is how you can make some really interesting network connections of these matrices. And we do this for any type of matrix. And that will ultimately lead to this Library of Conquest project that I mentioned to you earlier. So we're going to play a little game. Okay? So here is a matrix, a table with 4 rows and 4 columns, yeah? And I've labeled them to make it easy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now with every number, I'm going to associate a ball. Okay? Here are the balls, 4 balls. So far, so good? Now every time now there is a 1 in one of these locations, here for example, there's a 1 at row 4, column 2, I say there is a connection between ball 2 and ball 4. It's just a game. Okay? So I'm going to draw these connections. And for example, I start with the first row. I see there's a connection between 1 and 1. That's not very interesting. But there's a connection between 1 and 3, so I draw a connection, right? So we have these balls, and think about the connection of being a rubber band. Okay, so they're just lying on the floor, 4 balls, and I put a rubber band between two of them. And then I continue, go through all the rows, and gradually build all the possible connections that this matrix represents. And those are the connections. Okay, now you can believe me, or you check it quickly, or just believe me, those are the connections, right? Now I have 4 balls that are connected in interesting ways, 4 balls with rubber bands between them. But I have a choice. I can put it like this, or I can maybe put it like that. It's the same connection. And it doesn't really matter in this case. I could look at these connections, and these connections between these balls, of course, are related to the matrix, are related to the physics, are related to the engineering. And so if I can read this network, I can understand some of the physics. When there is a connection between 2 balls, there is a physical connection in reality between whatever these balls represented. So I can do now graph analysis. Where they do this a lot, management science and engineering, computer science, ICME, right? This is, if you're working in those areas, this is what a lot of people think about and look at. Now, this is all very good, but what happens if I have something like this, okay? So now I have more equations, more balls, and I draw all these connections. This doesn't, I can look at this and it's a complete mess. And think about matrices like Google uses that have millions of balls, right? I can draw this, but it's not very nice. So I'm going to play another game. I'm going to say, well, how can I really understand that structure by creating a bit more space between those balls in an automatic way? When I work with 10 million balls, I don't want to have to manually move them and unravel this knotted, woolly mess, right? So here's my game. I had these elastic bands between the balls. Now imagine the balls are magnets that are repelling each other, okay? So when there is a connection, I have an elastic band pulling balls together. When there is no connection and 2 balls get close, they will repel each other, okay? So I'm taking that whole mess and putting it here on the floor with these rubber bands, and I'm playing with the strength of the rubber bands and with the strength of the repelling charges. And then I just let it go. It will sort itself out, right? So the system, it will sort itself out, and it will find the most ideal arrangement. In fact, in physics, we say it finds the minimal energy arrangement, right? Maybe that rings a bell. Maybe you've heard this before. So what happens if I did that for this ball? So here all these balls are starting to move. Balls that don't have connection repel each other. Balls that have a connection stay close. And the strength of the connections was given by the actual number in the matrix in this case. And I indicated that with a color, right? And we get these beautiful patterns come out, which seems to be a mess. Now, when you then look at these patterns, they will tell you something about this matrix. They will tell you something about the physics. And so some of us have become an expert at reading these networks or graphs, if you like. This is a really nice example of a graph. So I can do this for lots of things that have connections. For example, I could do this for connections on websites. Now, websites are connected not just through words, but also through hyperlinks, right? So think about every web page being a ball, and every hyperlink from one web page to another being an elastic connector. And then we create a whole bunch of balls, and we just let it sort it out. So we crawled the Stanford web and played this game. Oh, this is actually a social network. Well, let me skip that. This is what it looks like for the Stanford web. Now, I tried to remember this morning what School of Engineering was, where it was. It's somewhere. So this is central administration. And when I showed this to John Hennessy, he loved it. He says, of course, we're the solar. The sun at Stanford, right? This is central administration. And each of these clusters, if you like, they represent another really well-connected unit on campus. So SoE is one of them. But I'm not sure if it is this mess here or one of those. And you want to be this mess. Because what does this mean, that it's messy? There's a lot of connections, which is what you want, right? If you have a lack of connections, then you either have a really lazy webmaster who can't be bothered putting in hyperlinks, or the departments or the research groups don't do their work very well, right? So we did this for the LCSH. So we went into the Library of Congress subject headings that have links between categories and subcategories. And it was a wonderful project with a couple of my students in ICME. And we created this network with these balls and these rubber bands for the LCSH. And we showed this to the catalogers. And they had been working as catalogers for 40 years or so. They'd never seen their work. Right? For them, their work was just index cards, right? Or fields in a database. And now we showed their work. And then we started joking around because one of the catalogers was responsible for this supernova. This is why I zoomed in on this. This is Japanese antiquities. And we labeled him the laziest cataloger of the Library of Congress because it's a supernova, you know, it's this beautiful radial thing because there's one main category, Japanese antiquities, and stuff hanging off it, but no interconnections between these items, right? So they say, you've been very lazy. Didn't bother putting connections in. And so at the Library of Congress, though, we made this a very interactive system. You can play with it also online. You can go in and click on each of these bowls, and then it comes up what it is and what documents are contained in it. And we gave that to Library of Congress, and I think they wasted a lot of taxpayers' money by playing with this thing, right? Like my students wasted a lot of our research money playing with this. So anyway, those are two examples of matrices and connections, and this is some of the stuff that we do. Here is the website for this galaxy. So I'll leave it at this. Yep. Wow, took a few more minutes than I should have, but nobody stopped me. So one question? Yeah, but maybe one question, burning question? No? Well, you know where to find me. I'm right there, right in ICME, so come in anytime and ask about this if you'd like. Yeah? Great.
So our next speaker, Professor Krishna Shenoy, is a professor of electrical engineering and, by courtesy, neurobiology. And he leads the Neural Prosthetic Systems Lab at Stanford. Professor Shenoy studies how the brain controls movement and is discovering ways to restore lost function after injury or disease. He's now involved in the world's first clinical trial that demonstrates how people with ALS are able to type messages on brain-controlled computers just by thinking they want to do it, which is mind-blowing, really, if you think about it. He, too, did a TED Talk called Neural Prosthetics. Let's welcome Professor Shenoy.
Well, thank you all for sharing your time here. I recognize several friendly faces and friends, and just want to start off by sincerely thanking all of you. It's really, honestly, a great pleasure every few years to hopefully get invited to share some of the things that we're able to do in the group as a result of the entire team, this entire wonderful group of people from the funding side through the student side and just across the board. So sincerely, thank you. So what I'll try to do here in the coming 10-ish minutes or so is try to convey what I'm meaning by brain prostheses in this somewhat peculiar sounding future whereby we need to be able to help people suffering from a wide range of neurological diseases and injuries. Okay, so over the past few decades, we've become somewhat comfortable, at least. Let's see if I have a laser pointer here. It's okay, I can just point. We've become somewhat comfortable with the idea of having several devices implanted in our bodies. For example, artificial knees or hips, cardiac pacemakers. And this is really quite a surprise if we were to sort of take a step back and go 40 years back in time. Who would have thought? Okay. Now the question before us is, what about the brain? Is that somehow different? Do we know enough about it? What types of things do we want to treat? Are we getting into really serious philosophical points about who we are? Because the brain anomaly is the site of our mental life, as well as ethical issues. So I'll try to keep it sort of nuts and bolts today and not veer into these much larger ranging questions by simply saying, yes, we do now know enough, and I'll share a little bit more about this, about the brain that we can get started, okay? We don't know everything about the brain by any means, and many of you may have been hearing that neuroscience is somewhat akin to physics. About 100 years ago, there was this sort of revolution going on. President Obama launched a so-called brain initiative 2 years ago to pour huge amounts of money in this direction. The campus is building a new Stanford Neuroscience Institute right where the Cogen plant is coming down. Okay, it's led by Professor Bill Newsom. So that is what will give us much greater knowledge about the brain. Where in the brain do different things happen? Where is memory? Where is decision making? Why can't I cogitate on a decision and come to any confident sort of plan of action? How do I move my arm? All these questions really come from a better understanding of the brain. Now that's great, but that's not exactly how medicine works. Medicine needs to help people today if it's possible, right? And we can all relate to this, right? I won't ask for a raising of hands, but we all have friends or family who are suffering from a variety of different conditions, many of which, the least treatable of which are neurological, right? Ranging from depression through psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia. And one of these really is the inability to move. And I'll build up to that. That'll be the next slide. But I first of all want to start off by sharing some historical prostheses that have to do with writing information into the brain. Now, what am I meaning by this? Well, it turns out that if you suffer from a few different types of blindness, it's now possible to implant a tiny chip in the eye itself so that when light comes in the eye, it doesn't have to impinge on the so-called photo detectors, the photoreceptors, to send signals into the brain. Instead, you can put a tiny silicon computer chip, just like it's made in CIS or Allen Building now, in there. It can detect the light, just like the CCD camera in your camera, okay? And what a wonderful way to get signals now into the brain with even a damaged eye, okay? People on campus, E.J. Checholinsky, Daniel Plonker, are working on systems like this. Cochlear implants, this is the classic. This has been around for several decades, has helped hundreds of thousands of people. If you're profoundly deaf due to the cochlea, the sound sensor in your ear, you can now replace it with a tiny microphone, a little chip, and then a coiled up little wire that has different stimulators in it. It's implanted in the ear, and people that are actually born with the inability to hear, deaf, can actually learn spoken language. Okay, it's really revolutionizing a variety of different treatment options. Okay, they're always treatment options, right? Nobody's saying these should be used or they're the right decision for many people, but it's an option. Parkinson's disease. Okay, Parkinson's disease, which has as one of its characteristic signs profound tremor. Okay, and I think most of us know if you're at a certain age, you know people that have Parkinson's disease. And you, of course, treat that to begin with L-DOPA, a dopamine precursor, a drug that often becomes ineffective. And what is now possible and what's happening in tens of thousands of people is that an electrode about 4 inches long is actually implanted deep in the brain. A wire is tunneled down to a pacemaker-like unit in the chest. And it trickles in electrical current, and it disrupts the aberrant electrical neuroactivity in a specific region of the brain, and that tremor just stops. It's stunning. So am I really saying tens of thousands of people are walking around with electrodes this long in their brains with battery packs? Yeah, okay. So hopefully this starts to give you the idea that there isn't something, at least technologically and medically, sacrosanct about the brain such that we can't access it. We can access it. We can put signals into the brain in these ways. And the final way is epilepsy, okay? We all know that you can, on a moment's notice, undergo a seizure event, and that can be profoundly disabling. It can be so unpredictable that you can't even drive a car, right? Well, what if you could implant a system in the brain that could detect when a seizure is about to happen and stimulate electrically a different part of the brain so that that seizure never happens? These systems are up and working. NeuroPace is just down the road in Mountain View, okay? So this is the right-in future, how to get signals into the brain. Now, for the balance of the time, I want to focus on readout, and this is where I'll show you a few movies from a patient suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease right here at Stanford that we're working with, and showing new abilities to communicate. Okay, so how do we read out information from the brain? Well, let's start with why we would want to do this. So many of you may recognize Christopher Reeve here, who of course was Superman, thrown from a horse in the mid-90s, broke his neck, and from that day forward was unable to move. And unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, really in no better condition, despite his considerable resources, and in fact, an entire medical foundation that supported our work and others to try to help repair the severed nerves in the spine. Okay, well, what if we knew enough about his brain that we could tap into the signals that make you want to move your arm? Okay, those are surely intact. You can still think about wanting to move your arm, right? We don't normally express it that way. We usually say, well, I don't know, I just move my arm, okay? But it turns out there's actually stuff going on in here, and you do prepare and really plan to move your arm. And if we knew enough about where to go in the brain and how to read those signals out, we could just bring those out to a robotic arm and bypass the injury and help the person that way. Or we could use those signals to stimulate the paralyzed musculature and reanimate the arm. Or we could go directly to a computer, move a computer cursor around to type out messages. And that's what I'll show you here in a couple of slides. So I'll show you just one slide by analogy to try to explain this whole business of how you read out the brain, okay? So let's imagine that it's 500 years ago and we're coming over to this new world. That's a distorted view of what America looked like 500 years ago, to the best of human knowledge. Okay, and you land on the shore and you don't know the native language, right? That's like going into the brain. You don't know what's going on, right? But through interaction, you start developing a little bit of knowledge. You sort of develop a little bit of a phrase book, right? It's like traveling to a foreign country and you know a few words, okay? That's sort of the status of neuroscience these days. We know enough about the brain to sort of be oriented, but we're still in search of the grand unifying principles, the core theories, to hold it all together, and that's why it's so exciting. So instead of going to the new land in a boat, we can eavesdrop on individual brain cells in the brain called neurons. That's what's shown there in black. There's 4 shown there. And we can lower a super tiny little electrode into the brain so that we pick up on the electrical activity around that neuron, okay? Now, surprisingly, this is often not known, there are no pain receptors in the brain, okay? Humans undergo neurosurgery every day here at Stanford and elsewhere awake, okay? And you stimulate parts of the brain to know where you are. If I stimulate here, I may get an arm movement. If I stimulate here, I may have my speech halted. That's critical for your neurosurgeon to know, so they know to avoid those areas when going in, for example, to go get a tumor, okay? So this is done all the time. There are no pain receptors in the brain because, well, what would the purpose be? Evolutionarily speaking, if you had a brain injury, game over, you don't really need to feel pain, okay? So what we can then do is we can measure voltage as a function of time, and we see these sharp deflections. All I want to call your attention to are those little spikes, those little peaks. And it turns out that the number of those in a given period of time means something. If I count 6 of those in rapid succession, that may mean I'm thinking about moving my arm to the left. Whereas if I don't hear anything at all, that may mean I'm wanting to move my arm to the right. And different neurons mean different things. A different neuron may have that sort of same pattern, but for up versus down. And if you record from enough of these neurons, which we can do by putting in these little electrode arrays. It looks onerous there, but it's smaller than the size of your pinky fingernail, okay? And it's only 1 millimeter long, so it just sits on the outer surface of the brain. We can record not from just one electrode, like shown in the orange picture, but we can record from 100 neurons. So all of a sudden, you're listening in on enough brain cells, and each cell is telling you something different, that we can then develop mathematical algorithms, right, to continue on the pro-math theme from the last talk, okay? Math is good. And we develop algorithms, right, that then run on computers that can then use that information to do something useful, something that you've lost the ability to do. Okay, so 2 movies and we're done, okay? So the first one is going to show you a side view of a 52-year-old, very brave woman who is suffering, unfortunately, from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This is a neurodegenerative disease that is slowly removing her entire ability to move her arms and eventually to speak as well, okay? And what we're doing here is we're just asking her a question. How did you encourage your sons to practice music? She's a wonderful musician. She actually built violins, okay? And her sons love music. And using the system of her thinking about moving her arm, she can't move her arm, but she thinks about it, we eavesdrop in on the activity like I just explained. We decode it, as it's called, and use that to move a computer cursor around a screen just like we would use a mouse, right? We use our arm to move a mouse left, right, up, down, and then click. She thinks about moving her arm left, right, up, down, and squeezing her hand. So she makes no movement, she thinks about it, and it happens on the screen. Let me show you it working. Okay, I guess the sound isn't quite coming up. I'll do it the old-fashioned way here. You're seeing the side view. What you're seeing at the top is a little connector we have to plug in to the wires that go to the chip. That will be gone very soon. That can all become wireless. And she's just thinking about moving that white cursor on a keyboard. And what happens when she stops on a letter she wants to select is she imagines squeezing her hand. It selects it. You can see it flash blue for a second. And then the message is copied up there. Okay, when they started I'm sorry, it's a little small, but it's a real movie showing everything to scale. Okay, and what she's doing is she's thinking about the answer to the question. She's typing what she wants and carrying on a conversation despite the inability to move at all. And while she can talk at this current moment, that unfortunately will be lost soon. Okay, I'll just show you one other movie of this. This is free typing, okay? That's in some sense the gold standard. It's just like we're having a conversation, okay? But also copying, if we say, okay, please look at this sentence and copy it down, it's very much like the touch typing test. So if we want to be more quantitative about how quickly and accurately she can type, we can run this task. And this also shows you the keyboard in more detail. And this movie, of course, is playing at real time. It's not sped up or anything. That would be unusual to do. So what you're seeing, depending on how good you are on your iPhone or BlackBerry, okay, is something like maybe half as fast as you type a text message, okay? So the question is this now good enough and high enough to be useful to a whole variety of patients? And we think the answer is yes, but to be determined. That's ultimately always determined by the physician and by the patient. Okay? So a glimpse of the future is presently in the research labs. The electrode array here now has a computer chip and an antenna on it, so that connector I was saying will soon be gone is gone. And there's much more to come. Better wireless powering, better circuits, better mathematical decoding algorithms, and more electrodes are some of the things on the horizon. So some of those things start to feel a little bit more home territory for engineering, though I would say no, engineering is really everything that we're talking about here and across all the talks this morning. So in conclusion, we think brain prostheses are really arriving now, and there's a whole bright future ahead of us. Thank you. I do, yeah.
Are there any questions for Professor Shenoy?
I just got to say wow.
Oh. Well, wow, I'll pass that along to our participant. All credit goes to her. Mary?
Hi. So you were in electrical engineering. How did you go from engineering to the school of medicine?
Yeah, well, there's how I did it, and now there's how you'd want to do it, okay? How you would want to do it here at Stanford is very simple, and that is to come in through any one of our wonderful departments in the School of Engineering, where interdisciplinary research is highly valued and highly encouraged. And then you could take classes during your PhD, okay? Do research in a group like my students. I have students from EE and CS and BioE and so forth. And of course, BioE perhaps focuses the most on this interdisciplinary. Now, how I particularly trained is I did my PhD, this is 20 years ago now, where these things didn't really happen, right? That was back in the days where biology was sort of butterfly collecting and no self-respecting engineer would do anything wet and squishy. My parents are still confused why I turned down a nice salary for a postdoc salary, but that's a separate story. I did my EE PhD, and then I completely shifted gears. I said, I'm in my mid-20s, this is the time to take the risk. I completely retrained in neurobiology, learned surgery, experiments, everything for 6 years. So it's really dual training. It's like 2 PhDs. And then that prepared me, in a sense, to be fluent in both. And so I sit in the Clark Center. We work with neurosurgery, EE, across the board. We don't know. We have an identity crisis. We don't know where we belong. So, okay, thank you.
So our next speaker is Professor Chris Gerdes, and he's from my department, Mechanical Engineering. He's the director of the Center for Automotive Research at Stanford, which is called the CARS program, and the REVS program. His lab studies how cars move, how humans drive cars, how to design future cars that work cooperatively with the drivers and even drive themselves. He and his team are the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and he was recently featured on the PBS episode of Making Stuff Safer with Chris Pogue, where he demoed Shelley, the driverless car, on a racetrack. He has also done a couple TED Talks as well. Let's welcome Professor Gerdes.
Great. Let's get started here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak with all of you here today. In my group, we're very interested in automated vehicles and what we can do to help this sort of technology get out on the road to improve mobility, but also to improve safety. So all of you have different occupations here other than designing automated cars, but I want to start off by having you think from the standpoint of a programmer, which is what our students are doing. And I want you to imagine a scenario of which you may eventually see a picture of, but until you do, picture this in your mind. You're an automated vehicle. You're driving down a residential street at about 25 miles an hour. In front of you runs a ball. A ball rolls out, a child rolls out from behind a van. You couldn't see it. Now what do? Brake. All right, how many of you think the automated vehicle should have the capability to brake? That's pretty generally agreed. Okay, what else might this vehicle have to do? Swerve. All right, how many of you think it's reasonable that the vehicle knows how to swerve out of harm's way? Okay, about the same, maybe a little bit less. What else does a car have to know to be able to handle this situation properly? Okay, maybe some anticipation that if it sees a ball, there's likely a child chasing behind it. Another thing is, of course, that the vehicle should be able to recognize that there are multiple objects in the environment, and one of them we're intuitively assuming is more important than the other, right? The child is preferable to hitting the ball. Now, here's one that gets a little bit tougher. What if you can avoid the child by slamming into the van? Is that something that the automated vehicle should have to do? How many of you think that it would be desirable for the automated vehicle to hit the van if it will avoid an accident with the child? Quite a few of you, huh? Particularly if it's a fatality of the child. You think injury to the... But now this is sort of an interesting thing, because most of the time when automotive companies make cars safer, they are trying to make cars safer for the people in the cars. But as we realize, as cars drive themselves through the environment, we have to consider not only the people in the cars, but people in the environment as well. And so if you think about your responses to this particular scenario, what you've said is that the car should have the capability to brake, to swerve, to get out of the way, and at the same time should be able to make perhaps some difficult decisions about what's valuable. And when faced with a situation where a collision is unavoidable, must be able to make the right decision as to which collision to have. So these are the sorts of things that we are working on in my group. In the first category, we have been looking at role models of people who can get out of harm's way very, very well. And so we've been looking at race car drivers. Was that the picture in your head? There we go. I have some strong feelings about this because this is actually my ball, my child, and my van. So when we think about what the car should do, we've been looking at race car drivers. Now, race car drivers may seem to be strange examples for safety. But as they say in racing, if you want to finish first, you have to finish. So it's very important that the car get to the finish line. And in fact, these folks are incredibly good at using all the friction between the tire and the road. Now, they're trying to be fast, but we want to use all the friction between the tire and the road to be safe. So how do we figure out what race car drivers do? Well, we go to the racetrack. Luckily, we have a sponsor who has a very wonderful collection of vintage race cars. So he lets our students go out to the track. They install sensors that seem like they might be more at home on a modern Formula One car than on a vintage race car. They're actually able to sense the position of the car out on the track to within about 1 to 2 centimeters. We are not allowed to drill holes in these multi-million-dollar race cars, so we have to get a little bit clever. The students have come up with ways to instrument the throttle, the brake, the clutch, the steering wheel, so we understand what the drivers are doing. We put in cameras so we can actually take pictures of them. We have actually been wiring up the brain waves of the drivers to see if we can make sense of that. We haven't made a whole lot of sense of that yet, so we need Krishna's help. And then we take the car out on the track and try to actually measure this and get a sense of what the world's best drivers are doing to adapt to these challenging situations, to get around the racetrack and to get out of harm's way, to be able to use the entire car's capability to avoid running off the road or avoid spinning out. And then we've tried to say, well, okay, now that we understand what human drivers can do, can we actually program a car to do similar things? So this is Shelly. Shelly is an Audi TTS, which is mostly stock. With the help of some folks at the local electronics research lab, we have tapped into the steering, throttle, and brakes, gear shift, so that Shelly can actually drive herself. Shelly is named after Michelle Mouton, who is the first woman to win the Pikes Peak hill climb. She was driving an Audi, not coincidentally. So we've had Shelly out on the racetrack, as Johnny mentioned. Nova shot a fun episode with David Pogue out in the car, and this is a little clip from that. Oops, we lost our, sorry.
Chris seems to think that
My bad.
riding is believing, and he wants to put my life in the hands of Shelly's computer.
We're off. Just like a big, expensive toy. Okay, so you're I'm not doing anything right now. This is not slowing down very much at the curve. No, we really don't have to. We just went off the road, dude. If you don't go up on the rumble strip, then you're slow. Any race car driver will tell you that. What a smart little car.
Shelly is constantly adjusting her position on the track. Her adjustments just aren't very smooth. But I guess smooth doesn't matter if your only priority is staying on the road.
Oh my God.
Fortunately, Chris can take over at any time.
That wasn't really why we installed the big red button in the car, but gosh, we were mighty glad that we had it there that day. So one of the questions, once we started to get pretty good with Shelley, we started to wonder, how does she stack up against an expert human driver? This is David Vodden. He's the CEO out at Thunder Hill Raceway Park, which is a racetrack that we often go to. And he's a champion amateur driver. He's won several Spec Miata championships, knows the track like the back of his hand. And so we decided to challenge him. So we let him have a few laps in Shelley and took his best lap. And then we let Shelley go out and run. And we decided to compare. And this is a little animation that you see. Shelley is, of course, in Cardinal. And so you see she takes a slightly different track than David does. She's kind of favoring minimum distance. He's favoring keeping the speed up by going a little bit farther. And as you see, that looks like a pretty good choice. He's about 0.4 of a second ahead. He gets a little bit better throttle off at the top of the hill there at Thunder Hill. And the two cars then get about the same. Shelley doesn't have the weight of a human, so as you get to these straights, she's got a little bit of an advantage and pulls back up pretty close to David. Now you see Shelley does a great job finding the shortest path. So David's wandering over the track a little bit. Shelley says, the heck with that. You can drive straight here. And she gets a little bit of a time advantage. So coming around the back, they are neck and neck right up to the point where he cheats. Oh, what's up with that? What was that? So he goes completely off the road. Shelley holds on to that, and he gets a bit of an advantage. Shelley does really well through this last turn, despite the fact that he cheats again. And they go on to the straight. Now, this is where the weight advantage really pulls ahead, because Shelley can out-accelerate, not having to carry the biological life forms. And she wins this by about a half a second. This is about a 2-minute and 18-second lap, roughly speaking. So she's got about a half-second advantage. Now, to be entirely honest, I could start this video at a different turn, and David would be ahead by about a half a second. So there's these slight variations. So it's not necessarily a clear win, but the fact is that she's racing a pretty comparable lap time to a highly talented expert driver who knows the track extremely well. And besides, this is my video. I can start it where I want to. So the interesting thing is that Shelley does it very differently than the human. She's doing it in a very calculating fashion. Like Margot, I believe that math is beautiful. Shelley is using all of it to sort of calculate how to get around the path the most at the highest speed. Now, the human sort of feels their way around the track. And the humans can sort of see opportunities that the car doesn't. We've programmed in a line and said that's the edge of the track, and the car adheres to it very well. The human race car driver goes, psh, somebody drew a line on the track. I mean, what's the use of that? I can go faster by running over it. And it turns out that this is actually interesting not only to racing, but if you think about the cars going down the road in everyday driving. So take a look at this situation. I've got a van parked where it has absolutely no business being parked. What would you do in this situation? Everybody, nobody wants to sort of own up to violating the California Vehicle Code, but you'd go over the double yellow line, right? You probably wouldn't stop and just be like, they'll come back eventually, right? But if you think about it, we as engineers can program that line very harshly, in which case that's exactly what the car should do. But if we don't, then we're breaking the law. Now, can you sell a product that has deliberate law-breaking ability in there? Do we wait all day? Honestly, they'll be back sometime. You hope they didn't go on vacation. We've reserved parking lots on campus sometimes, and it's like, I'm sure they'll come back and get that car out of the way, won't they? So if you think about this, it's astonishing how often we do this. If you bike around in the hills, people do this all the time. Everybody's going over the double yellow line to give more room to the cyclist. It's illegal, but we do it. What about speed limits? There's another one. Do we obey the speed limits? Well, maybe on a 25-mile-an-hour road, you could say that's a really fine thing to do. But what if I'm on an on-ramp merging? Do I then want to obey the speed limit, even if that's going to create an unsafe situation, because now I'm like trying to merge in, going 10 miles an hour, slower than anybody else around me? I was actually in an automated vehicle that was trying to do exactly that the other day. It was not pleasant as an occupant or for the other road users. But again, can we have the vehicle break the law? The challenge here is that as we drive, we have different desires. We have a desire for safety. We want to get to our destination. We have a desire for mobility. We want to get there fast. Maybe we want to get there efficiently. And we have a desire for legality. And when these things come into conflict, legality doesn't always win. So we can program in the laws, but do we create a car that nobody will want to drive with? It's kind of a philosophical question. So we kind of went out and found a philosopher. This is Patrick Lynn. He's a professor of philosophy at Cal Poly. He was on sabbatical in my group for a year and really got us thinking about some of the philosophical ways of thinking about these problems. Now, it turns out we learned that philosophers ask a lot of questions and don't really care if they get any answers. Engineers love answers, and we don't really mind if we're answering a question that no one ever asked. So we had to kind of find a way to mesh those two things together. And it turns out this is one of those areas where asking the right question is really important. One thing philosophers talk about a lot is the trolley car problem. Suppose I have a runaway trolley car, and 5 people are going to get killed, unless I shift it to another track, at which point an innocent person who would otherwise be uninvolved gets killed. This is a great ponderable in philosophy, and Patrick has pointed out that these things could happen with automated cars. This is his graphic, which I like a lot, particularly anything rendered in 8-bit graphics with a DeLorean just shoots to the top of the pile. And so one of the things that people have proposed about this is that, well, self-driving cars have to make these sorts of decisions. How would it choose? Do I kill the 1 person or kill the 5? And it's interesting because you can kind of turn that around and say, well, is that a question that we should be asking? In fact, is that the right question? Or should we find a way to design cars that have a respect for human life, that have a moral imperative to protect it? And in these really odd situations that one can conceive of, can we simply accept that they'll do the best thing possible? Philosophers have not been able to resolve the right answer to this problem for thousands of years. It's unlikely that engineers will do that in the next decade with automated vehicles. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe we can find other ways to program in sort of a moral imperative to avoid collisions and to protect life. This is exactly what we're doing. We're working with philosophers, and the questions that the engineers are asking and the philosophical frameworks, it turns out, are actually pretty compatible. So we can take ways that philosophers have reasoned about these problems and program in the car. In fact, actually, some of the philosophers have joked that one of these days maybe you can have a button in the car where you can choose your favorite philosopher. We're driving like Kant today, it's more of a Nietzsche day today, and we can dial that in. Not so much that we can translate so directly, but the fact is that what we find is that these simple things that engineers are dealing with, how hard do I encode that double yellow line? What weight do I put on collisions? Is it right to allow this collision with the van to avoid the human? These are things that philosophers have written about for a long time, and actually they can provide very, very relevant guideposts for our students. So just to conclude, we were out at the racetrack filming with some wonderful folks from Stanford News Services, and they sort of said, well, wait a minute, let me get this straight. Your life is you guys spend time out on the racetrack during the day, and then you come home and think deep philosophical thoughts. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much it. And so I want to kind of conclude with a thank you to all of you, because of all the hard work that you do, you enable us to be able to go out with students onto the racetrack, develop this research, and come home and think deep philosophical thoughts. Thank you. So I think we may have time for questions. I know Bob's going to set up here as well. No one? No questions. That makes it easy. Yes, Ralph?
Can cars hear?
Can cars hear? It's interesting that there are certain things that you can put ultrasonic sensors. So some of the ranging systems that are used to avoid collisions in parking are actually using ultrasonics. So they are, in fact, using microphones and sound waves. In fact, waves slightly higher than what we can hear with our human ear. It's easy to kind of put a microphone on a car and measure that. It may be harder to ascertain that. And I think as we think about our senses in the car, it's really important to think, do we need hearing, for instance, to respond to emergency vehicles? Sometimes the first sign that you have of a problem in the car is something you smell. So it's sort of, I am not aware of anybody who's got an automated vehicle that can smell, although I was giving a talk at System X, and Boris Merman was like, oh yeah, that's no problem, we got that. So the technology exists here at Stanford, it's just not yet in the cars. Yeah. Do we have time, or do we need to move on? I'm happy to hang out afterwards in the reception, so if people have questions there and want to talk, more than happy to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks for the time.
So our next guest is Professor Bob Sutton. He is a professor at management science as well as by courtesy at the GSB. He's the co-founder, or a co-founder, of the Stanford Technology Ventures program, as well as our own D School. And Professor Sutton studies the links between managerial knowledge and organizational action, innovation, and organizational performance. He's a prolific writer and has written 8 books, including The No Asshole Rule, which is one of my favorite books. If you turn on your TV or radio, it would not be unusual to see Professor Sutton on PBS, NPR, Tech Nation, or CNN. Professors, the No Asshole Rule is actually a New York Times bestseller, as well as Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Business, and Business Week. Let's give a warm welcome to Professor Sutton, who will be talking about 12 things he believes, describing a dozen key lessons he's learned from his 35-year career.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So I'm standing between you and the refreshments. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to make a public commitment at 1:25. So I'm saying this to my handlers. What I'm going to do is, as advertised, I'm going to talk about 12 things I believe I'm last, and after seeing the technology, I'm glad I have no technology. So I've been teaching variations of an organization and management class, I think, for 35 years. So 3 years at Michigan as a doctoral student, 32 years here. And I figured out about 10 years ago that everybody wants to end with closure in the last 10 minutes and pretend that we all can summarize things in a neat little ball. And so what you have in front of you is essentially what I do the last 10 minutes of my introduction to organizational behavior class. So you are saved from taking 10 weeks of torture with me. And this is the main lessons. Okay, so that's what we're doing. And they vary randomly. So let's see how these go. The first one is, and one thing that really sort of strikes me, is that people who are in management and leadership, they always think that the more management, the better. Very often they do. And they want to hire more managers. They want to manage people more closely. And it actually turns out there's a bunch of research that shows there's a very predictable effect that if you are managing someone and you watch them more, you give them more feedback, and you evaluate them more often, it's unclear whether it makes their work any better, but it's very clear that you will think their work is better because you put more effort into it. And there are some positives to micromanagement, but the negatives are, well, it interrupts people, and it also makes people less creative because the boss is watching and they don't want to screw up. So sometimes this notion of, first do no harm does not just apply to medicine. So that's one to keep in mind, whether you're being managed or not. So I guess for those of you who aren't managing people, this means it's good to hide from your boss sometimes. The second one, so if you read stuff by management gurus, there's lots of management gurus, it's like an industry. They always talk about how important passion is. And this is one of the things that sometimes I read people's LinkedIn profiles. Everybody's so passionate about everything, it's unbelievable. And I think passion is a good term, but since we've used the word asshole, I'm going to put in a good word for the virtues of not giving a shit sometimes. And there's at least 2 examples, and I can go on and on about this. There's at least 2 examples. One is, we all can't do everything fantastically well. But we all have to do a lot of different things. And there's some things that we do just have to check the box and go through the motions so we can save our passion for those things that really matter to us. And I'm somebody who also would advocate that there's a lot of things that are worth doing but are not worth doing well, despite what my mother told me. So the other reason that indifference is important, and this goes back to the no asshole stuff, if you're in a situation where you're stuck and it's a bad situation and people are treating you like dirt, learning the fine sort of art of emotional detachment and almost pretending you're not there and going through the motions is sometimes a necessary short-term solution. So that's that one. All right, I got to keep moving. The next one is, now, with all due respect to the deans, we have these wonderful new deans. We've had lots of wonderful deans and presidents. They always have these really big goals, okay? And big goals are great. They're just fabulous. But it's really important to look at research about what happens when there's a big, hairy goal, but people don't know the paths they're supposed to take. This leads people to freak out and freeze up. And the other thing is there's also a fair amount of evidence that everybody's got big goals. The people who win are better at persistence and grit. So you may have even heard the difference between leadership and management. leadership, it's big, hairy goals, vision, oh, that's real nice. The people who win are better at actually doing the little things. So that's another thing I believe. Oh, you get what you expect from people. So this is something for those of us who have kids and those of us who manage folks and even think of ourselves. If you expect people will work hard and do great things and be flexible, it increases the chances they'll be that way. And if you expect that people are lazy, backstabbers and so on, you'll get that too. So you get it's very important to think about the assumptions you have about human behavior. And one, since there's some administrators in here, I especially, with all due respect to the people who keep track of our money and everything, and I really like Dimitri, he's actually invited me to do this and everything, and he's one of those people. One thing I always remind them is that if you expect people to lie, cheat, and steal, they are more likely to lie, cheat, and steal than if you actually trust them. And there are times when people do lie, cheat, and steal, but very often you get the behavior you expect there too. Okay, number 5. I'm doing okay. So this is the no asshole rule. So it's really interesting to see what's happened since 2007 when I wrote this book. So there's this big controversy, which I think is a false controversy, about whether it helps to be an asshole as a boss to get ahead. And we could go into that in detail, and I could tell you that some CEOs are alcoholics and are very successful, and they still get ahead. It's something that people, I think, succeed despite rather than because of. But the thing that's completely clear from all the peer-reviewed research is that if you work for or with somebody who treats you like dirt, it's really bad for your physical health, it's bad for your mental health, it's bad for your productivity, it's bad for your creativity. So even if it did help that person get ahead, it still would be bad for you. So if you work with somebody like that or for somebody like that, you should sort of remember, number 1, these bad things are going to happen to you, or more likely to happen to you. And the other thing is bad behavior is incredibly contagious. So that's my warning there. So this is, I love we have the professors. I'm the 4th professor to profess to you. I think, so just from what I can tell, it's been mostly us making statements, right? So this is not how leadership should actually work. So we're like we're saying one thing and doing another. And the whole university system seems to be rigged so we get the students to give us the right answers and to say smart things. But if you actually look at leaders and people who tend to get ahead and learn stuff in life, they're also good at asking questions and listening. This is my buddy David Kelly, our leader at the D School. His ability to listen and ask questions never ceases to amaze me, would be just a local example. Okay, number 7. This is something that the Stanford faculty and students are terrible at. So there's a large body of research that shows that the most effective teams that do non-routine work, creative work, this is more important than brainstorming, more important than all sorts of things, they know how to fight over ideas in an atmosphere of mutual respect. And a famous organizational theorist, Carl Reich, described this as fighting as if you're right is listening as you're wrong. The Stanford students and faculty are magnificent at fighting as if they're right. We as a group, I will include myself, are terrible if listening as if we're wrong. And at least in the D School, we're trying to make a little progress on this. But the problem is the Stanford faculty teach the classes, so it causes problems sometimes. But that's still, anyway. Number 8. So my understanding at Stanford is that if you want to get a raise, one of the best things to do is to have more and more people report to you. Isn't that true? That's my understanding. John Hennessy has confirmed this when I was teasing him about this. It actually turns out that throwing more people to problem, on average, makes things worse. If you get a team that gets bigger, especially if you grow, say, from 5 to 11, it gets worse. It gets worse in 2 ways. First of all, people spend more time actually coordinating and less time working. And then their interpersonal relationships degenerate. And just think of the difference between going out to dinner with 10 people and trying to keep a conversation with them versus 3 or 4. And a hallmark of great organizations, Apple, McKinsey, the US Marines, they have, the basis of them is sort of a 4 or 5 person team. Agile is 5. So when people say to me, somebody's a terrible leader, the question I always ask is, how big's the team? It's amazing how good people get when you get rid of some of the folks. And it's nothing personal. It's just that just more of us make things worse. Number 9. So there's a guy named Rob Cross he's at the University of Virginia, just now up for full professor. And he did all this research to try to figure out what makes people the most effective leaders and who would get ahead and get the best performance evaluations. And in the end, he threw in this one question when he was doing this technique called social network analysis, which is, after you talk to this person, do you have more or less energy? That's the whole question. And now across about 60 different studies, this question of whether or not after somebody talks to you, on average, they have more or less energy is one of the most important things. And one thing that's also two important caveats here, it turns out that most bosses are terrible at knowing what it feels like to work for them. And the worse bosses they are, the worse they are at realizing what it feels like to work for them. All sorts of evidence like this. So if you think that people feel energized after they talk to you, it may not be so. All right. Number 10. Okay. So if you want to avoid reading any of my books and want to have sort of, to me, the point that runs through all of them, and this is something that's very D-schoolish, something I learned really from David Kelly, for starters, years ago, which is a good diagnostic question, whether you're a good manager, whether it's a good organization, that's innovative, is what happens when people fail. And I have 3 minutes, so there's 3 quick things that can happen. This is an oversimplification, but it works. One is the solution that my kids want when they wreck one of our cars. Forgive and forget, right? Have you ever been in this situation? Teenage daughter wrecks car. I don't want to talk about it, Dad. Well, we're going to talk about it. So that's, there's no learning. The second one is the Silicon Valley standard, which is remember, blame, stigmatize, humiliate, and then possibly ostracize. That creates so much fear that people won't talk about their mistakes, and they get very good at covering their mistakes but not learning from them. And the best organizations, for example, hospitals that learn the most from medical mistakes, have forgive and remember. You forgive for safety, you remember so everybody learns, and you remember because if the person keeps making the same mistake over and over again, that's a sign they should be doing something else. Okay. The last one, and I think especially, those of the School of Engineering, we've got new deans. I got a new department chair coming up. There's all sorts of change. And sort of going through life with David Kelly from IDEO and the D-School, this is one of the most important things I've learned. And for people in administration, this is especially important, and for faculty too, which is that it's great to keep trying to make things as orderly and neat as possible. But especially during times of change, but in general, it's always a little bit messed up and confusing. And so to some degree, we've all got to sort of just embrace the fact that there's going to be uncertainty, it's going to be uncomfortable, and keep marching forward the best that we can. My wife, who's a CEO of the Girl Scouts of Northern California, she had an employee ask her, she said, "So Marina, when is the change going to end?" And Marina hugged her and said, "I'm sorry, the change is never going to end." And in some ways, I think we all, including me, I have to accept this. I'm dealing with new things too as well. Okay, my last one, and then I'll be done in 30 seconds, is that, so in all of this, and at Stanford and we're at work, there's always this emphasis on how important work is. We're at work, at Silicon Valley, we're going to work, we work like crazy. And I just think that it's important for us all to take a breath and kind of realize that work maybe isn't that important. And I actually even talked to a Le Monde reporter last week, and he asked me, he said, "So in France, we work to live, and in the US, you live to work. Is that true?" And I think it was true. So I think maybe we could all back off that a little bit. And my friend Jimmy Maloney, I'll end here. I raced sailboats with him for years, and he was always complaining how much work sucked, and he was going to quit. And he did. Him and his wife, they sold their little house. They put their 3 kids on a sailboat, and they cruised for 2.5 years. And now they're living in New Zealand. She works 2 days a week as a substitute teacher. He works 1 day a week selling sales. And 2 of their 3 kids are on the New Zealand Olympic team, sailing. So it's been sort of interesting to watch him in action. Okay, that's enough. So thank you very much for your patience, and I appreciate everything you do for Stanford. All right. And now I get the hook.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. And it's just so inspirational to see what's kind of going on behind the scenes when we're all plugging away at our desks. And it makes me very proud to be part of this. I also want to thank the SoE Connect committee for putting this event together. And stay tuned, check your emails for upcoming events, and we hope you can join us out in the lobby for some snacks, and our speakers will be out there for questions. Thanks.
Thank you.